Okay, so let's get started. Welcome, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful summer. This is the first research seminar after the summer break, so I hope you're all relaxed and ready to go for the next semester. Couple of announcements. Well, actually, I only have one announcement. Maybe Saba has another one. The IGRI website, in case you haven't visited lately, has been redesigned. So if you wanted to take a look and give us feedback on the design, we like it, obviously, but it's always good to hear from others. We also concluded the second annual IGRI workshop, grad student workshop and conference, which was the second one in a year and was partially in person, at least for the grad students it was. And so that was a good success. And we're looking forward to organizing next year's seminar. So if you have any ideas for the seminar, please feel free to reach out to us. Ideas are always welcome. Saba, is there anything I'm missing?
I guess the one thing in terms of future events, we're going to be soliciting participation for upcoming IGRI research seminars for this upcoming year. So we may be reaching out to you individually, but also if you know of anybody who you think might be interested in presenting, please do share their names with us and we'd be happy to reach out to them. And we'll also send out a broader call through the listserv regarding this. But yeah, we're hoping to have a great lineup of presentations and hope you'll continue to participate in these events. Thanks.
Thank you, Saba. Yeah, so for today, we're going to be introducing Cali Curley from the University of Miami. She's an assistant professor there, and her research emphasis is on local government policy design and adoption, and she specifically focuses on policy goals related to sustainability, including equity and the environment. And our recent research addresses U.S. state-level responses to COVID-19. And it's been recently published, I think, in Public Administration Review. And today she's going to be talking about using the institutional grammar and the rule typologies to conceptualize equity in the policy design of the policy process. So without any further ado, Cali, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you, Ute, for a lovely introduction, to all of you for being here today. I'm super excited to share this work with you. So I'll go ahead and kind of jump in, since now you know everything there is to know about me, given such a lovely introduction. So I did prepare some slides today. If I can get them to work. All right, can we see the PowerPoint or no?
Perfect.
All right, lovely. So I want to give you a little bit of a background on how I got into this. So as we all know, I'm kind of like a local governance environmental policy scholar. That's sort of where my career started. But I had my son, who's now 4.5, at the end of 2017. And when I returned to work, I really started to see the world through a different set of eyes. And I think that that's normal, but those eyes really kind of helped me to pick up on some of the design features of how the work environment was set up, and that made it really difficult for me to kind of compete in the same way that a lot of other people competed, because, you know, they didn't have the same kind of home life. And so it really put me on this path of trying to understand like institutions and how they can promote equity. So it's been a long time in sort of conceptual spaces for me. And I've really struggled a bit with how to do this, to bridge this sort of equity-based concept in a way that lets us look at institutions as we design them, right? Like policy as we design it, and whether or not it's going to be functionally equitable or not, right? Because in the policy world, we always think about policy and like equity and outcomes, right? So this was a little bit of a shift for me in sort of how we think about this stuff. So as I go through today, I'm going to kind of walk you through 2 projects, high level, so we can get into the weeds on the second one once we get there through discussion, okay? The first one is a bit of like a meta review where we've looked at a large body of literature specifically related to equity across public administration and policy. I'm going to go through why I'm really motivated to explore this topic in policy design for the policy process particularly, talk through a potential strategy for how we might actually identify equity in the policy design phase of the policy process, and then go through 2 examples looking at 2 different definitions of equity, distributive and procedural, and then maybe have a brief talk about the potential that I see in sort of what the next steps are for this project. So that's where I'm going. I'm glad you're all along for the ride. So when we talk about this meta review study, I want to put it into context. Okay, so we looked at 22 different journals, 11 public administration, 11 policy, from like tier 1 and tier 2, basically. So we tried to get a breadth a little bit across these different journals. We scanned every single journal and every single article for equity in the keyword, title, and abstract from 2009 to 2019. Okay. You're talking, across the 22 journals, over 8,000 articles that have been published in this time window. 127 of those 8,000 use the word equity in the keyword, title, and/or abstract. Out of over 8,000 articles published, there were only 127 that use the word equity in the keyword, title, or abstract. So this already starts telling us a couple of different things, right? Like when we talk about equity in the social sciences, we may not name it. And we oftentimes don't necessarily think of it as central to the project that we're working on, right? It's something that maybe it's a byproduct or a conclusion that we can draw, but it's not necessarily the body of work that we're contributing to, right? But if we were to do this for efficiency or, political feasibility, for instance, or, economic outcomes, that number would be vastly different, okay? I know because we did it for a couple of the journals just to sort of see how vastly different, and it was substantial, okay? So 89 public administration articles, right? So even of this 127, you can already see a delineation, right? Where public administration has somewhat embraced this term equity a little bit better than perhaps policy, where we have 38 articles across 11 journals over 10 years that include the word equity in the keyword, title, or abstract. Among these, we then dug in to see, well, what's the most common definition, right? So we have these 127 total articles. The term fairness is what is used most frequently to define the word equity. There is one definition, and I'm sure some of you will recognize it, that was fairly frequent, which is over here on the right-hand side. And by fairly frequent, out of the 127 articles, it was used in 6 of them. Unfortunately, fairness, even as a definitional term, right, and the ability to define equity was not done even across all of these studies. So there were a fair number of them that were fairly vague or unclear, or didn't actually operationalize the concept of equity at all. Okay. So when we were going through this meta review process, there were a few papers in the environmental justice realm that used what they called the procedural, distributive, contextual frame for equity. So these are 3 different variations on how we understand the term equity, and they're frequently used in scholarships. So the concepts that they use in environmental justice to define these different frames for thinking about equity are what we use, but we term it all under the bigger umbrella term of equity and like vaguely, don't define it. So what we did was go through the 127 articles and actually code them for the type of equity that they were focused on based on this conception of equity, these 4 concepts. So distributive is the one that's most common, right? It means we're talking about the fair distribution of resources, services, or outcomes. We often see this most in policy outcome assessments, where we are looking at, how well a particular good and service is being delivered to different subsets or groups, typically based on race, gender, maybe even socioeconomic status or LGBTQ status, right? And so And that's what distributive is. According to the way that we have coded them, it's the most common of the approaches, right? The definitional approaches. Procedural, which is also relatively well established, is often looking at, how the process, typically participatory, is also usually across groups, right? How equally we have access to participate or engage, or, make some type of voice be heard in the process of either policy or public administration service delivery. Contextual, which we skip a bullet point in case you're following along, is the third in the primary, environmental justice literature. And that really talks about this, how somebody's individual circumstances might influence how they engage. So if I don't have the information, the ability, the resources, or even the power to engage in this process, then it's going to limit my ability to receive benefits from the procedural equity or the distributive equity, right? The fourth frame is going to be recognition. And this is really about how my individual identity factors, right, influence my ability to be involved. So if I identify with a specific religion and you hold your meeting on a high holy day for that particular thing, I am not going to be able, as a member of that religious group, to participate or engage in that activity, right? So these things are more central to like our individual identities, right? Those classifications or characteristics that we oftentimes see. So having done all of this, right, we said, okay, let's think about, what these studies are actually doing. So some of them define equity, some of them don't, but they're all trying to contribute to the understanding of equity in some way, right? So we looked at their methodological approaches, conceptual, whether they're doing a literature review or a meta review, whether they were quantitative or qualitative, some type of mixed methods approach, historical, or a viewpoint, right? And so what we see, right, is that quantitative approaches are the most common when it comes to thinking about equity. These quantitative approaches are typically that classification, right? So they're looking at how someone's race or gender influences an outcome variable, okay? This is really common in gender pay studies, right? Or racial pay studies, where they're trying to examine how well people, how equally people earn, right? So these are going to be more in line with that distributive piece, right? It's the part that we kind of better understand how to measure in a lot of ways. And so that's kind of why you see the bulk of these studies in that space. One of the things that we see is that there's actually a decent amount of qualitative work, right? Almost a quarter of the studies on equity in policy and public administration. However, there's been fairly little conceptual work on equity in policy. And so that's really where I kind of decided to work, right? So my question is, if we're going down this path of, trying to embed equity into the policy process a bit more, how do we actually do that? And in what ways can we build systematic measurement of equity in the policy process? As a person who has, been exposed to the institutional grammar, of course, my brain instantly went to the policy design space, right? And so we're really talking, right, about why this matters. And fundamentally, equity has really been conceptualized as an embedded trade-off, right, between concepts in policy like efficiency and political feasibility. It's not the first thing that comes to mind, right? It's more like Ostrom lays out the choice that decision makers have to make between efficiency and distributional equity, right? We might not be able to achieve both of those things simultaneously. And to kind of put this in context for you, Sabatier's Theories of the Policy Process, which is one of those books that we all know and absolutely positively love, has been kind of the primary text used to teach the policy process for a long time. It's got over 3,500 citations, right? its 2007 edition uses the word equity a total of 9 times across 350 pages of text. Okay, so you have this really seminal policy process book that we've all, probably read and have been taught from or teach ourselves. And equity is only really covered in one of the chapters, and that's Ostrom's chapter. Okay. And in this chapter, it is conceptualized like this, as a choice that has to be made between, with efficiency and feasibility and the ability to actually get the policy adopted in the first place. And this really stuck with me because I find it really hard to construct, right, a policy that we can't say, let's design this policy that we know is efficient, that we know is feasible in the most possible, most equitable way that we possibly can, right? So the institutional grammar gives us an opportunity to really kind of narrow in and zone in on the language of the policy itself that might actually drive equitable outcomes. And so this is where I'm going, right? So there's this call, I think, for policy design, right? And Peter's kind of argued for this emphasis on policy design, to where we can have these design choices that have equitable consequences on the outcomes, right? And choose those design features that can help to enhance equity. So there's scholarship out there since 2002 that really talks about, information channel choice, right? It's like how we choose to communicate information determines who winds up hearing it. So if we're not choosing the right channel, then we're not going to have equitable access across all groups, right? But that, kind of stopped at that point, right? And so then in 2019, you start having conversations around the move to indirect service provision and concerns around equity in those spaces, right? So there's a lot of research out there about, third-party banking systems and how if you use a third-party banking system to provide loans, they're likely to not have equitable outcomes because they tend to be a little bit racist, right? Sometimes a lot racist. In terms of depending on things like credit worthiness and individual bankers to make choices on loans, right? These things can lead to very vast differences in who's awarded how much money and in what circumstances they qualify for or are eligible to receive these loans. So we already know that loan programs, for instance, that rely on these indirect service provisions are more susceptible to inequities and inequitable outcomes. So calling for policy change, for equity to be included in the policy design process is really a change to how we're thinking regarding tool selection, right? From which policy tool do we choose to achieve equity to how can we enhance the design of this policy to achieve equity? And that switch of, not necessarily thinking about what tool best achieves equity, but rather thinking about how to design the tool to achieve equity is, I think, a really significant one that we need to be making. And the only way we can do that, right, is by focusing on the institutional grammar itself. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, there was some proposed methodology by Carter et al., who really talked about, connecting policy design to the IAD framework. And they proposed 4 different steps to do this, right? 1, apply the IGT to identify the core elements of a policy design. 2, classify those institutional statements into rule typologies. 3, explore the target action situations that the statements structure and link. And then 4, classify the statements by their level of decision-making, right? So this is one way to do this. It's not easy. But there's something to be said, right, about connecting the IGT and rule typology to these design elements. But it has to be done, somewhat strategically. And I think that we need some way to frame that, right? So for me, the frame is going to be equity and how we connect the IGT and the rule typology to one another. So here's what I did, okay? Worked through different policy design items, right? Like the problem definition and goal, benefits and burdens, target populations, rules, tools, implementation structure, social construction, rationales, and underlying assumptions, connected them to pieces, right, parts. Pieces and parts makes the word PEATS, in case you were wondering where that came from. And then, of course, thinking about the bucketing of those, IGT elements to the rule typology. So using this, we have to think about what that means for equity. So the traditional measures that we have for equity along the lines of distributive and procedural are really analyzing who receives some kind of payoff, right? Money, incentive, et cetera, or benefit from a program based on a series of classifications. And of course, the traditional measuring of procedural equity is really analyzing who applies for that program versus who's receiving it based on a series of classifications, right? The same buckets. So these two kinds of grouped measures, if you will, give us kind of a baseline of what it is that we can do, right, with the data that we typically have as of today. So other ways that we can think about that, sorry, I jumped ahead. Other ways that we can think about this in terms of using the rule typology and IGT and design elements is by breaking them down under these buckets of how do we conceptualize distributive equity, right? Well, we already know it's about who gets what fundamentally, right? So this means that we can look at things like the attribute and the object. So who's the target of the tool, who's the recipient of it? Are there sanctions in place for non-compliance with whatever that rule is? Is there a benefit or a payoff? And what does the scope, like range of acceptable outcomes really look like? And then under the procedural bucket, we could look at things like attributes, the targets of the tools, the aims, so the actions that might be needed to take, the boundary, who's going to actually be eligible to engage or participate, the choice rules, how's that decision actually going to be made? And then aggregation, how many people are involved in making this fundamental choice, right? And there are benefits and of course costs, right? So of this type of an approach, one, it requires far more labor, right, than the kind of analyzing at the end side, the data that we already have about who participates and who doesn't. We have to code the actual, documents to see where these things might be. And then of course it requires intentional classification, which we don't necessarily have an existing schema or protocol for, right? So in some ways, it's a little bit more open to interpretation than our classification strategy for the traditional measures of equity. But there are some really big benefits of this approach that the traditional measures don't allow, right? It can predict equity prior to adoption, right? So it can see where the potential pitfalls are, who's at a potential loss in terms of participation or engagement. It can identify design flaws in a particular policy, even before participation, but also after participation, right? If you do that traditional analysis by engaging with the IGT, you can then say, oh, maybe this is why that particular group is underrepresented in participation, right? And then of course, it can be used to compare different policy alternatives along the lines of their ability to achieve equity. So this approach is a lot of fun, but what does it look like? So this is, I always have a tendency to want to show you where I'm clicking and then I click and it goes to the next slide. So I apologize. But so this is a little bit of background. If we need to come back to it, we can, but it's just kind of here for some context. Okay. So let's take, for instance, an energy efficiency program, right? So I've worked a lot with the City of Tallahassee Utilities. They have some pretty awesome programs like rebates and loans and audits that are really accessible to individuals within the community to participate in. And I'm only going to focus on the rebate and loan program. So let me give you a little bit of an overview, right? Energy efficiency rebate, basically, the way that this program works is that an individual has to, purchase a piece of equipment. They have to be a utility customer. And then within 90 days, they can upload their receipt to the city's website to receive money back on their utility bill, okay? The loan program, they have to be a homeowner in addition to being a utility customer. There's a similar process in that they need to apply, but they have to participate in an audit, an energy audit prior to engaging in the program. And so it's like you do an energy audit, they tell you what things might qualify for a low interest loan. you get a low interest loan from, insulation, roof, solar panels, water heater, whatever big picture items, big ticket items you can think of, right? So these individuals, right, they have to own homes because the way that the loan is secured is through a lien on your property. And also they have the ability to shut your electric off if you don't pay the full amount of the cost, okay? But this interest, this loan, right, is a subsidized interest rate. So if you were going to get a loan for, say, 13%, it subsidizes your loan to 5%. So it makes it more affordable for you to do this higher costing thing, okay? So when we talked about distributive equity, right, this is about who gets what. So we looked at those different items on the last few slides, and they were like attribute, object, the or else payoff, and the conditions around the particular rules in the policy. So here you have two potentially different attributes, right? The equipment purchaser and the utility customer versus the homeowner and the utility customer. They both need to be successful applicants, right? So the successful there is because it's important. We'll get back to it in a few minutes. The or else, for rebates, there really is no other, there's no or else, there's no compliance requirement, there's no condition, right? The or else in the loan is that you have a lien on your property. So there's problems if you sell it before you pay back the loan. There's problems if you try to default on the loan in terms of what happens to your home. And then of course the fact that they could shut off your electric, your utility. And that in some instances could be water as well, not just electric. The payoff is different between them, right? $40 to $300 versus subsidizing from 13% to say 5%. And then the conditions around this are different as well. In the rebate instance, you have 90 days to submit your receipts. And then of course the receipt has to be on, eligible Energy Star items. And then in the loan condition, you have to follow through with city county inspections and have an approved contractor or vendor. It doesn't have to be from their approved list, but they have to approve whoever it is that you work with, okay? So there's a couple of different questions, and I've selected a few here, not all of them, and we haven't touched on all of the ones that are in here. But so there's a couple of different questions that we could use this distributive equity perspective to kind of answer, right? So there's a little highlighter thing here, right? There we go. I'm going to focus on this one for the purpose of our conversation, which is, the question of, are the potential attribute and objects initial conditions considered when we think about who's benefiting and who's not benefiting from the receipt of or participation in these programs, okay? All right, so thinking about these initial conditions, right, on the who's participating in the program, we can identify these places where those recipients may not be treated equitable or have equitable access, right, to the policy itself. So rebates, for instance, in this program, you have to have the accessibility of upfront capital, right? So some of these things that you put into your home that are Energy Star rated are more expensive than the traditional version of the appliance. And so you have to be able to put that money in upfront before you get your rebate. So if I'm looking at getting a $300 rebate, I need to have access to an additional $300 in order to get that rebate in the first place. I have to have internet access, right, to be able to put my receipt in for the application. And of course, English language skills in order to follow through with the application process online that is currently only in English. For loans, you're looking at home ownership as a barrier, right? Applications that go through formal review may be looked at for credit worthiness, which means that the participant has to be credit worthy, the internet access and English language, and then of course, time availability, because there are audit and inspection requirements. I, as a participant, need to be able to take time off of work, right, in order to have the audit and the inspection done. So you can already see potential design elements here from looking at the IGT through this perspective that really shape which groups of people are going to be able to participate in each of these programs and why there may be distributive outcomes from the design of the program that are actually not equitable, right? Okay, so let's look at it from the procedural lens, right? We're still looking at the same set of attributes. The aims now define sort of what the actions are that the attribute must take in order to participate. So this is going to be like scheduling the audit, identifying the improvement area, selecting a vendor, applying for the loan, having the work inspected, and then you get this benefit, right, of energy consumption reduction. The boundary pieces are going to be, in the rebate instance, you have to be the residential electric customer. You have to have the upfront capital, Energy Star certified equipment, contingent on home ownership, energy audit, the property lien. And then of course the choice piece, which is how, your sort of ability as an individual participant to make these decisions might be challenged, right? And then of course, what decisions are being made in this process. And then the aggregation piece, we know that the utility representative essentially makes the final decision about who's awarded the rebate or the loan. And then of course, what each of these individuals who are participating are responsible for. So what we can see from here, and I'm looking at the time, so I'm kind of speeding up and I apologize for that. And here, I don't remember which one I'm going to focus on. Oh, yes, I'm going to focus on how actors are making decisions here. And we don't necessarily have voting rules, but they have to make a decision rule in this instance. So how actors make decisions, we can identify different places where the recipient may not necessarily be treated or have equitable access based on this sort of procedure element. And so for rebates, rejected applications are typically based on incomplete information, maybe outdated receipts, but timeliness of submission is going to be based on those initial conditions, right, that we just talked about. So if we don't have access to internet for a month at the house, that's going to impact how quickly we can get our receipt uploaded, for instance. For loans, rejected applicants are going to be based on incomplete information, unapproved vendors, non-compliance with an audit, right? So here, the applicant reviewer may make internal decisions about worthiness of applicants, not just based on that information, but also information at their disposal, such as utility bill payments being made on time, right? Conditions of good faith in the language of the policy. And then of course, they have a limited pool of funding for these loans. And so they may be supplied on first come, first served basis, which also means, right, that the timeliness of submissions is going to matter in this instance as well. And that may again be based on some of those initial conditions that we talked about. So that's an awful lot of information. I see potential. It's not perfect yet, right? But I think there is this opportunity, while it's sort of in its early stages of exploration and conceptual development, to really create a, not template, but a path forward for how we might think through what these very, granular IGT statements can help inform us of as we move through, not just thinking about equity, but other more vague and complex concepts in the policy arena as well. And I really, based on this example, right, of looking at the rebate and the loan, feel that there's this clear ability to kind of compare policies for opportunities to where inequities could arise. And we can then use those opportunities to either alter implementation or to build in, safety measures to prevent inequities from manifesting. And then, of course, I see a potential for empirical operationalization here, but I've not entirely nailed that one down yet. So that's, forthcoming, if you will. But all right, that's all I've got for you for today. I tried to stay in the 30 minutes, so hopefully that was okay.
Callie, I'm not cutting you off. This is your presentation. It's your show.
Oh no, we're good.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting, and you've given us a lot to think about and to discuss. So I'm going to open the floor to anyone who has questions for Callie. Kate?
Hi, Callie. Thanks so much for this presentation. I'm Kate. I'm at University of Illinois, Chicago. I actually did my undergrad at the U. My question, and I'm more in the public management space of, here's a policy, now we have to implement it. And I think you did a wonderful job kind of previewing and thinking through, you know, how the language of a policy, we might be able to identify issues of equity in just the way that it's written. I'm curious to kind of know your process, or if you can talk a little bit about when you apply IG and sort of think about, right, you can get really, really granular, or you also can think, and as a qualitative, like a mixed methods person, it's like you can get really granular, but you also can think kind of across the scope of a paragraph or a document, to maybe talk a little bit about the scale, or sort of the like unit, if you will, of analysis that's really helpful in understanding equity issues in the way a policy is written.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an appealing answer to this question. For me, what's really been helpful is kind of looking at it from both sides, right? So my background, right, is that I was a trained economist. And so I then went and got a PhD in public administration and public policy. So I came from a very empirical, methodological, like quant-driven space. And to say that I've moved in a completely opposite direction would be an understatement, right? So looking at it from the granular perspective, I think has given me more in terms of being able to say, okay, how do these rules, these statements interact with one another, so that I can then say, okay, there's a landscape, right, of where these things exist and how they move together. But I don't know that the granulars always, don't kill me for this, but necessary, right? In some ways that granularity can get us lost in a lot of minutia that maybe isn't appropriate for the question that we're answering, right? It's always appropriate for something, but maybe not for the question that we're answering. So for this particular process, because there isn't a lot out there on, equity in general in the policy process or in policy, really, it's hard for me to say that a granular space isn't necessary, right? Because I feel like we have this ability to look at this sort of distributive outcomes, but we have no understanding of why those distributive outcomes are the way that they are. And so the distributive outcome piece paired with the granularity, right, might be the connection that we need between understanding language and the outcomes that exist in the real world. And so we haven't had that yet. So for me, and this is why I say it's not really an appealing answer, it's because it has to be both, right? Like, I think they each give us something really important. And we may have had the one and we had nothing in the way of the other. And so with both of them, I think we can make progress. But that's just an opinion, I suppose.
So that's thank you. And also I sort of lean that way of like, there's a space for both, right? It's sort of what's the right tool for the research question.
Exactly.
But yeah, this is really exciting research. Thanks for sharing it.
Of course.
Derek, you posted something in chat. Are you still there? Did you want to ask Kelly directly?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm marginally here. I have to run in a few minutes. Yeah, Kelly, really great research, really interesting. Relates to stuff literally I need to run to do right now. So that's wonderful. So back to the tension, and again, I respect your ability as a sort of empirical methodologist in econ. So can you reflect on that a little bit more? How do we balance out that granularity and get beyond the case studies that capture the complexity? And that's always kind of that tension, this kind of research, that how do we scale up, and as you think through what would scaling up a methodology that could capture that do right, and what would it do wrong?
I think that's the $1 million question, though, right? Like,
well, that's what I'm asking you, because you're smarter than I am.
That's not true, but I think it's something that we've all struggled with, right? Especially with the IGT, is how do we kind of bring this up and scale it in a way that it is manageable and informative? And I think doing this work through a specific perspective or lens is going to help us answer that question, right? So like the equity piece, I'm not there yet to give you a definitive answer, right? But I can already see that there are certain parts of the coding that are more important, if you will, than other parts of the coding. And so it's almost like for each different, you know, complex policy topic that we're interested in studying, we really need to think through and identify what those elements, either of the rule typology, the policy design piece, or the IGT, that are most important and most relevant for what we need to do next, which is like that, you know, scale up. How do we measure these things quantitatively, and what does the landscape of them look like? It's not an appealing answer, I don't think, but
No,
I think it's the one we all have to wrestle with.
It's the start. I think you touched on a little bit with some of the information flows and putting it up front in the process. I think that was really critical. I'm also thinking about all the work that was done on the Commons and the IGRI Forest project and all the data collection that went down. And when it really came down to it, if you look at decades of research, you know, the one thing that stood out again and again, regardless of methodology, I just saw somebody use machine learning to give the same result, was group size.
Yeah.
And that's kind of it. And all that complexity and those hundreds of variables that were collected, you know, group size stands out. So it sounds like there may be a small subset of variables there that really do lead us to better understand equity in policy design. Yeah, so this is great food for thought. Thank you. I'm going to have to run.
Yeah, good to see you.
Thanks, Derek. Good to see you. Juniper?
Hey everybody. Hi Cali. Thanks for sharing your work today. This was super good. Your thinking is so clearly organized and well articulated. Kudos. You're on it. I have two questions. The first one is about this. I mean, obviously the stages of the policy process, as Chris Weibel likes to say, is a heuristic, right? It's not how it actually unfolds. But I'm curious if you have any kind of initial thinking about how your theorizing fits into more of the stages, right? Because right now we're kind of looking at how do we categorize existing policy. So it's kind of not looking at earlier stages or even kind of policy feedback type concepts. So that's one question. And then my second comment is a colleague of mine here at UMass. He is not in our field, but he is doing research on how even well-intended policy designs that are intended to fix equity problems and challenges don't always work out to accomplishing those goals. And he's just kind of doing this in the space of anthropology. That's his field, kind of critical anthropology, looking at policy and equity outcomes. And so that's just kind of in the back of my mind. Not that we shouldn't be trying, obviously that's not the message to take home, but it's kind of like, okay, what are the equity implications? That's like question one. And then question two, what have people been doing in the policy design space to try to address them? And then three, why are those still running? Why are those efforts, those well-intentioned and even well-designed efforts, still kind of running into less than fabulous outcomes in terms of improving equity? So those are my two comments. Thanks again. I really appreciate your work so very much.
Yeah, thanks, Juniper. Those are great questions. So I'm going to work backwards. So I might need you to remind me of the first question. But so this second question here, I think is really important. And it's one of the reasons that I really felt passionate about doing this, because it kind of stuck to me that there were all of these policies that were intended to correct, you know, inequitable service delivery, right? So the audit program in Tallahassee is a free energy audit program. Anybody who is a customer of the utility can participate. If you have a house in the city or an apartment in the city, you can participate. But by and large, the participants were upper middle income, white members of the city, right? Despite the fact that this was deliberately designed to enhance, energy efficiency in low income homes. And so you have to start looking at the way that the program is actually designed in order to answer, well, why isn't it actually helping this problem that it was designed, right, to fix? And they were using these traditional information communication systems that they had always used, which of course targeted the same group of people who had always participated in their programs. So they designed a very different approach and strategy, right? So we wound up coming up with this idea of like parking vans. And I think it was like an offhanded comment that we had made of like, ideas or whatever. And it's like park vans in neighborhoods, right? So like that they know that the city has this service and that it's like advertising that you're in there, right? And so they started to see this and they started to go and they did community outreach and they put people in churches and talked to community leaders, and they were able to actually get higher rates of participation in those communities that had actually had closed doors by changing the implementation delivery, right? And so that approach is really important because you're really thinking strategically about the design and the aspects of it that are, accessible or inaccessible to the people's initial conditions and how they come, right, willing or unwillingly to participate in the program that you designed, right? I think that we all know the old adage of like, if you build it, they will come, right? Well, if you build policy, they will not come, right? Unless you design the policy in a way that is open and accessible and intentional in targeting and attracting the right, whatever that means for the target, right, of the policy subset of the population. And so I think that that's absolutely right on, right? In terms of stages, so Saba and I actually wrote about this a little bit in our piece in Policy and Politics last year. And what we were talking about in there is that policy design is so integral to these other aspects of the policy process that it's really important that we consider it in, not just the policy design stage, but when we're engaged in the development of policy, right? Before it even hits the floor for adoption, we should be thinking about these things. When we're thinking about the outcomes, we should be understanding what the design features were that may have led us to those specific outcomes. And when we engage in policy learning, it shouldn't necessarily be, and I'm not just speaking, like I'm just speaking for myself, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or not on your interpretation of what we wrote, Saba. But so like, even in the policy learning space, right, we should be looking not just at, what we are learning from the failures or successes of particular policy, but the design elements of those policies that were particularly, disastrous or successful, and learn from them and change them, not just, throw the policy out or overwrite it or, keep it going just because it's the status quo and we should keep it going. And so I think that it's really something that has not been done. And we actually just put out a call for proposals in case anybody is interested in starting to do this, to look really at how the policy design piece interacts with these other elements of the policy process, because it is something that I'm going to say we both see. This is the only time I'm talking for both of us, I promise, as pivotal, right, for the next phase of scholarship.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So Kate, your hand went back up.
Oh, this is great. And as I'm a public management person, but I did my doctorate at NC State and trained by Thomas Birkeland, who was a big part of like teaching us about policy process and policy studies. And one of the things that's really interesting is sort of the like, where does feedback happen, right? And I think that I I would love to state, like, hear how this goes as you all develop this, because I think, right, so you had an opportunity to really see how like a policy then was like taken out into the world, right? But often that embeddedness for a researcher to really be a part of like community engaged research, right? To be in the room where feedback is happening is so unique. And so I just want to say, like, I think that's awesome. We should do more of that, and to maybe think about like what spaces conversations are the language or are the way that policy feedback is happening rather than documents, right? So like if you can speak a little bit to sort of being able to think about through institutional grammar in not a written form, right? But in those conversations, in interviews or focus groups or rooms where they're sorting out the challenges and seeing how that's unfolding.
Yeah, I think that that's a common challenge, but there are people who are working on it. And I cannot remember, but they were presenting work for a special issue that I know someone in the room was putting together. So maybe they could comment on the ability to identify institutional grammar through verbal forms more. But I think it's something that is coming, but it's not necessarily something that is done yet. Would that be right, Saba? Yeah. So it's
I
coming.
think this, sorry, unmuted. I think that's right. I mean, I think that this is where there's a lot of opportunity when we get to just in general moving to maybe if not the token level, not the word and phrase level, but just moving even more granular in just sort of considering, as you said, Kelly, policy design components and policy design elements and the patterns that we see around those, moving away from this sort of monolithic treatment of policy. Any other questions? Any other questions? If there aren't any questions, I just maybe follow up and plug the conference, the call for abstracts that Callie mentioned. So we're going to be, Callie and I are co-hosting the conference on policy design in February of 2023 at the University of Miami. So if you want to join us in Miami in February, please submit an abstract. And not just because you live in Syracuse and want to go to Miami, but you are interested in joining us in these interesting conversations about policy design. I will quickly pop a link here in the chat. So 1 second. Kelly, this is going to take me 1 second to pull this link up. So if you have anything else you'd like to share.
Thanks to everybody for coming and their questions and engagement. I really appreciate it.
Here's one more random comment, Callie, for you, since we have a moment. I think it's interesting in public programs when the lien actually goes onto the property, because that goes into the chain of title, which has implications for subservience and the order of who gets what if something happens to a property. And that has equity implications too, like, like the loan has to be subservient to the initial mortgage in some cases, and sometimes they require that it goes in the reverse order. And so I think there's also ability for inequity to arise in those interactions between the banks. So just another little like technical interesting point to me. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, we're nearly out of time, but thank you, Callie, so much for sharing this work for us. And I didn't quite catch what Uta said at the beginning. This is under review or forthcoming in PAR?
Under review.
Under review, so hoping to see that in print very soon.
Oh, yes.
So, all right, well, have a wonderful day, everybody. Look forward to seeing you again soon.